25 tips to instantly improve your 3D characters. The lips are basically the inside of the mouth, but turned inside out. Did you know that? Today I want to give you a few tips and tricks that I have learned creating characters throughout the years. I'm also curious how many of these you already knew. Feel free to post the amount in the comments. The first one is pretty simple. Start simple. When you're a beginner, as you should always remember, the main shapes are the most important part of the character or of whatever you want to sculpt. To make sure that the most important thing of a character or whatever you're sculpting looks correct, I would recommend starting with simplified references. Talking about references, there's actually one thing that anime, I guess, gets sort of right, and that is the side view of characters in anime, I guess. They have this very distinct sort of face shape. The silhouette isn't 100% realistic, of course, because the lips aren't really included, but we can take it to kind of use that as a guide to know where to place the lips and chin in relation, for example, to the nose and the eyes. Of course, proportions can always vary, but it is a great reference, especially for when you're starting to sculpt or when you're more of a beginner, to learn the basic proportions of a face. Something that I always do, and you should always do as well, of course, is when you're starting to sculpt, as I said before, the main shapes are the most important thing of the sculpt. Even in the roughest state of your character, you should be able to see the sort of end result in there. If the very rough sculpt already looks kind of iffy, I guess, I would recommend, rather than adding more detail, sticking with the low resolution and adjusting the low resolution until you find a place where you're happy with it, and then you can go further with it so that you don't run into any problems later. Also, don't get discouraged while sculpting. The handsome Squidward face is probably included in all character sculpts that you do, or that anybody does, at least in my experience. And that is sort of probably the most discouraging phase of the sculpt. But I'm here to say, just don't give up. Just continue sculpting, continue adjusting the face, and at some point, handsome Squidward will turn into what you always imagined the sculpt to look like. It's just the middle phase between, you know, the roughest face that you have created and the more refined face that you want to go further with. Or, of course, if you want to sculpt handsome Squidward, then it's the entire face, I guess. There's one thing that I always try to avoid in my own sculpt, and that is the same face syndrome. What that means is basically that no matter what character you create, it's basically like a character, your character is cosplaying different characters, I guess. The character always has the same face, or the face look always looks the same. The way you can avoid that is pretty simple, actually. If you sculpt, you tend to sculpt a certain face shape, certain lip shape, certain nose shape, certain eye shape. Try to always add variation into these proportions that you always go with. So for example, if you always create characters with big lips or even small lips, try to do the opposite maybe, or just kind of vary it a little bit, change the lip shape, change the nose size, nose shape, just to make sure that all your characters look different and unique. A general rule that I use to construct my face is the rule of halves. The rule of halves basically says that taking the full height of your face, go to the middle of that height, that's where the eyes should lie, roughly, of course. Then have the lower half once more, that is where the nose should be, the ending of the nose, basically. And then if you have the half of the half, that is basically where the lower lip ends. The rule of 50s basically can give you a good measurement where the main parts of the face should be. Of course, there are always variation in faces, but of course this comes before you actually make your character unique and change some proportions. So you can basically always use that for your character. In the beginning, we talked about lips. Let's continue that. There's one tip that I always run into that helps with lips looking very puckered or very flat. Looking at the profile of the character, the corners of the lips should always be in between the end of the nostril and the eye. Of course, there's always variations, but as a good, general rule, place the corner of the lips right there in that area. I actually have a follow-along sculpting video that shows you exactly how I sculpt lips. If you want to see that, then you can find it on my channel. I'll probably also link it at the end of this video. Another small one is for the nose, looking at it from below, coming from the tip to the root, I guess you could say. The root is wider than the tip, which also means that the nose holes are basically like these beans, these elongated, I guess, ovals that point to each other. That is just a small thing that you should always keep in mind when you create noses. Nose holes are not just round, they actually are like beans that point to each other. Another, I think, more complex shape in the face is the ear. There are two letters that you need to create the ear. The first one is a big C that creates basically the outside of the ear. And then we have a sort of distorted Y on the inside. If you create these two, then you have the ear. Of course, you also have the sort of little bump where the ear hole would be. But of course, that is just like a small addition that doesn't really change the shape of the ear that much. Something else that I see sometimes is that people create characters that look like this. They look very shocked or very insane. And the reason for that is a rule that I always follow. How basically the eyelids cover the iris. The iris is covered by the upper eyelid, but not by the lower eyelid. The upper eyelid covers roughly like 30 to 50% of the iris usually, and the lower eyelid really only touches the iris just a little bit. It basically is right on the iris. And I have two more tips about eyes. Even last year, I still had an eyeball model that wasn't really correct. The iris was too small in comparison to the rest of the eyeball. The right proportion for that is basically 50% white and 50% iris. That should give you the correct proportions and the right size of iris for your character. And then how do you place the eye? Another rule that I follow there is the visible part. The iris should always be in the middle of the hole, I guess, so that there's the same amount of white on the right side that it is on the left side. This sounds kind of obvious, but sometimes when you place your eyes, you just kind of make sure that they fit well into the shape that you've already sculpted. You should make sure that you place the eyeball so that the iris is in the middle of the eye hole shape, I guess you could say. If it sticks out on one side, you can then change the eye shape with sculpting the eyelid shape. Otherwise, it can lead to some weird cross-eyed look, or it just doesn't look right if the character looks in different directions. Next up, I have 3 simple moves that you can add to your character to instantly improve your character's face and make them look more realistic. The first one is basically here going from in between the corner of the eye and the nose, creating like a diagonal line going outwards. That is basically the upper line, dividing the fat pad next to the nose and underneath the eye. The next one is a line going from the nostril here, down and around, or even just going to the corner of the mouth. That one defines the fat pad above the mouth or cheek, on the cheek a little bit better. And then there's one more. You add a little bit of volume around the corner of the mouth or a little bit above the corner of the mouth. That basically is a fat pad that is very small, but adds a lot of character and a lot of depth to the mouth and also to the character in general. And after you're done basically creating the face for your character, and you don't really need symmetry anymore, I would recommend always adding asymmetry into your character's face, at least for not heavily stylized characters. Realistic faces always have asymmetry in them. It also can look kind of weird if a face is perfectly symmetrical. That especially applies to wrinkles. So always make sure that, especially once you're adding wrinkles or just general details, or maybe even just moving the proportions a little bit so that the nose is a little bit off center, do that once you've done everything else. That will increase the level of detail by actually quite a lot. Talking about wrinkles are basically creases, or you would probably use the crease brush for them. But there's one gripe when I see creases or when people sculpt creases, and that is basically there are 2 types of creases. The first one is where you basically carve with a knife, for example, into, I don't know, wood or metal or whatever, so you have this scratch in there. Then the crease is basically flat surface, crease, and then flat surface on the other side again. The more common crease is the one where 2 volumes meet each other. You can see that type of crease, for example, for wrinkles. You can see that where the muscles sort of overlap each other. The second type of crease requires you to not only carve into the surface, but also add more volume around the surface, so that you basically add the 2 volumes that meet each other. It is just something that isn't really obvious when you begin sculpting, but it's something that you should always keep in mind and will immediately improve your wrinkles or even just the muscles for your character. So keep that in mind, okay? I don't want to see that again in the next personal feedback session. If you want to join that, join the Discord. Link for that is in the description. Oftentimes, your character's face might look perfect, but it still looks kind of weird. The reason for that is probably because when you're sculpting your character, you probably haven't added hair yet. You don't really need to add hair yet, but what you can do is you can use the mask brush to, for example, add the eyebrows and maybe even, I guess, the hair shape, so that you can see what your character would look like with eyebrows. And eyebrows and hair can even change the way your character looks. And maybe you want to change something once you've, drawn in the eyebrows. So make sure that before you go further with the character, you always at least draw the eyebrows and the hair just to see what that would look like before you go further with creating the actual hair, for example. Of course, usually you're not just sculpting a head The head is probably mounted on a neck, which is then connected to the body. And there's an interesting little, I guess, dynamic between the head and the neck and the body. And that is, if you look at it from the side, from the profile view, you can draw a line from the chin to the back of the head. And then you can draw another one for the neck. And then we have another line going from the shoulders or from the neck to the chest. These lines create a zigzag shape, which shows you that the neck isn't perfectly straight down. It is actually sort of diagonally backwards and down. When you're sculpting characters, make sure that you don't just pull it down, you also pull it back a little bit. And then you push the chest a little forward again. Okay, one more time, let's go quickly back to the head. The hair, what I like to do is I like to sculpt my hair first, just so I can see what the general shape would look like and whether I need to change anything. I would always recommend to never, okay, it is forbidden to use the snake hook brush when you're creating the hair in sculpt mode. Once you start creating hair with the snake hook brush, it is very, very hard to make that look realistic. What I would recommend is just focus on the main shape of the hair and sculpt that as like one big shape. That can still show you what the hair would look like in the end, but you don't need to use the snake hook brush to create these fine detailed hair strands. I don't use it, and there's a reason for that, okay? So you shouldn't use it either. Something that we ran into in one of the last personal feedback sessions is how size changes the proportions of your character. You might have a regular sized character, but then if you want to make your character very small, there are proportions that change between these sizes, especially for example the size of the eyes, in general the size of the head, maybe the limbs get a little thinner, especially when it's a smaller character. So if you want to make your character look a little smaller or a little bigger, there are things that change in the proportions that you need to keep in mind so that the character actually looks big or small. If you just, scale your character down, it just looks like the environment got bigger and not the character got smaller. Another one that took me quite a while to learn, when you create your character and you don't use the blockout method to create your character, you just sculpt the character basically. What oftentimes happens is that the arms are a little bit further outwards than they should be. If your arms are basically just hanging down, like, just straight down, there shouldn't be a gap in between the arms and the chest. If they're too far away, then you should bring them a little closer. Let's stick with the arms. Let's go to the hand. There's one thing that you should always remember. The thumb is a black sheep in the finger family. The thumb is not a finger actually, it is just a thumb because it only has 2 bones instead of 3 bones. Another one is when you just rest your hand, the thumb is actually rotated by roughly 90 degrees compared to the fingers of your hand. Let's now go from the black sheep to the herd to the fingers. There's a little bit of webbing in between each finger bone. When you sculpt your next fingers, I would recommend starting by creating like a slope where the fingers should start and then pulling the fingers out from there. This way you can immediately add this webbing without having to add it later. A few more general tips. Details should always be complementary to undetailed surfaces. This way you can make sure that you don't have too much detail covering the entire surface. If you have too much detail, it kind of obstructs the general structure of the character and it gets very hard to see the character in as what it is. You can just see sort of noise that doesn't really tell you much about what the character looks like. Another one that I see quite a lot is when you create clothing, for every edge of the cloth, you should add a seam. Pieces of clothing are made out of different sheets of cloth or whatever material you want to use, or leather or whatever. And these pieces need to be sewn together so that you create, a jacket or a t-shirt or whatever you want to create. The sewing lines are basically the seam lines that you can see on every piece of clothing. You should always add that in your character's clothing as well. Otherwise it looks kind of weird, empty and unrealistic, generally. So on every edge of your piece of clothing, you should add these seam lines. More is definitely better in this case. And the last one is about lighting your character. There's a simple trick that I follow to make sure that the character is lit well for my renders. Sometimes if you add a lot of lights, it can get very hard to see what each individual light actually does. And by fully focusing on one after another, you can make sure that once you combine them, the character and the lighting looks perfect, or at least almost perfect, and you just need to do a few adjustments. If you want to see another one of these videos and you want me to focus a little bit more on, for example, the body or anything else, feel free to post whatever you want to see in the future in the comments. And if you have any more questions, you can always of course post them in the comments as well. Thank you for watching. Maybe I'll see you next time. See ya.